Do you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I hear you, yeah.
Okay,
But,
there you go.
hi.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you
I'm
virtually.
wondering how I can make it like sharing screen. Where is the sharing? I mean, so that the audience can see both faces simultaneously.
Yeah, let's see. The way that I usually use it with students, there's a share screen icon at the bottom of my
Right,
Zoom window.
right. Multiple participants can share simultaneously. I've already clicked that on.
Okay.
I hope it works.
Because both you and I are on the screen, on my screen right now.
Yeah. Well, so probably it works that way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so. So were you recording it for sharing it with the students, or are the students going to be here?
No, I'm recording that actually. It's not live now. I mean, it's a bit late for Iranian audience. It's almost 10 o'clock in the evening now in Iran. I suppose they're sleeping now.
Just
Yeah.
getting started here.
So thank you very much, John, for accepting my invitation, actually.
No,
So
no, it's a pleasure. It's nice to meet people that are interested in this topic.
thank you very much. Yeah, and I mean, as I started recording that, and I mean, just because the students are actually dealing with humor, like on the very basic level, I try to have a very like preliminary and basic and elemental, let's say, discussion with you on humor. But first of all, I had some lines from your website. If I'm not wrong, this Nihilist Void, from your weblog actually
Uh-huh.
about you. Is it true? It's your weblog, I suppose, yeah?
The Nihilist Void, it is.
The
Yeah, I've
Nihilist
been
Void,
doing
yeah.
that for quite a
So
long time now. Yeah.
right, yeah. So I'm going just to introduce you like a couple of lines that John Marmysz holds a PhD in philosophy from State University of New York at Buffalo. His primary research interests focus on the issue of nihilism and its cultural manifestations. Marmysz is the author of Nihilist Notebook, 1996, Laughing at Nothing, Humor as a Response to Nihilism, 2003, The Path of Philosophy, Truth, Wonder, and Distress, 2011. The Nihilist, a philosophical novel that's very interesting, 2015. And Cinematic Nihilism, Encounters, Confrontations, Overcomings, 2017, right?
That's correct. That's
Yeah.
me. That sounds like me.
Okay. Yeah, I bet. So although my primary aim and ambition was to have a talk on humor, but as you've written quite prolifically on nihilism, I might ask you how you perceive of nihilism. I mean, once a notion is fleshed out, I suppose for the students, it would be easier for them to connect it to like to humorous amusement, and so on. I have something from the first chapter of your book, I suppose. I mean, I quote you that by far nihilism is by far the most common and widely accepted understanding of, that by far the most common and widely accepted understanding of nihilism today places it in the category of things to be avoided and shunned. So why nihilism, John?
Nihilism is, yeah, the quote that you take from the book highlights the fact that nihilism has traditionally been seen as a negative phenomenon.
Right,
It's
yeah.
something that most philosophers that are concerned with it see it as something that needs to be overcome or dissolved or eliminated. Me personally, my perspective on it is that that's a mistake. That
Right.
nihilism, it describes, basically what it does is it describes the human condition, a condition of alienation from superlative goals and values, and that as a part of the human condition, one, it's not something that we can overcome, and two, there are actually positive consequences to being alienated from our highest aspirations. Um,
Right.
among those positive consequences are activity. That if if we had the opportunity to accomplish our highest goals, there'd be nothing left to do.
Right. True. Yeah.
I remember someone writing a paper called "The Boredom of Heaven." You know, what would you do once you got to heaven? There'd be nothing to do. Everything would be perfect. And so, you know, one of the positive consequences of this alienation is that we're constantly striving. You know, there's constant activity that we can engage in, and that's a good thing.
Right.
I think separation from, you know, our highest goals and aspirations also has the positive quality of making us aware of what it is that we do value by means of their absence or the distance that we have from those values. So oftentimes when people have something, they don't appreciate it. You know, I mean, in a very concrete level, I didn't appreciate the area that I live in here in California until I left, until I lost it and then came back. And so nihilism, you know, I think also has that you know, positive aspect to it. So I think those two things, the fact that, you know, nihilism, in my definition of it, in any case, describes the human condition. It's not something that can be overcome. We would be something other than human if we overcame it. And two, it's not all that bad. There are some positive things. Now, I'm not saying that that nihilism is completely positive. It also has negative aspects to it, but that's part of being human, is dealing with the good and the bad.
True, true. I suppose in the third chapter of the book, if I'm not wrong, I mean, there is a chapter in the book. I remember, actually, I talked about your book in a workshop in Tehran in 2014, I suppose. It was like before my PhD defense, and actually we focused, and it was so interesting for the students. We focused on these distinction actually you make between Russian and German apprehension of or conceptualization of nihilism. Could you please flesh it out a bit, like elaborate what the difference initially for you was or is?
Yeah, well, the what I classify as the German form of nihilism is traceable back to Kant's philosophy, Immanuel Kant, and his distinction between the noumenal and the phenomenal realms of you know, of reality. So the noumenal realm is the thing in itself. It's objective reality. It's reality as it exists, independent of human perception. According to Kant's transcendental philosophy, we only engage with that objective reality through the imposition of concepts. So our minds impose concepts on the noumenal, the sensations that we gain from the noumenal realm, and then organize them basically. The way I describe it to students is I say that, you know, a good analogy for Kant's philosophy, it might be anachronistic because of course computers didn't exist during Kant's time, but it's almost as though Kant is thinking of the human mind like a computer program that imposes itself upon the data of experience. And then that's how the phenomenal world that we all experience and that we share in, you know, in common, basically in common, emerges. And so, you know, I and many people find that a very convincing picture of how it is that humans are related to the world around them. Now, the consequence of that split between the phenomenal experience of reality, which is interpreted reality, and the noumenal world is, according to Kant's own words in Critique of Pure Reason, that we only know that the noumenal exists. We can't know anything about it. And so he splits us off from knowledge of objective reality in that sense. And immediately critics jumped on this, claiming that Kant had alienated us from truth. That truth, big T truth, is normally thought of as corresponding to that which is non-subjective, that which exists independent of, you know, of human interpretation. It's what's permanent, you know, kind of like the Platonic forms. And so the accusation was that Kant had, Kant's philosophy of transcendental idealism was a form of nihilism. meaning nihil, nothingism, that it's a philosophy of nothingness. It creates this gap between the human mind and absolute truth, and so we're abandoned to this kind of nothingness. So the German theme of nihilism seems to follow that sense of fracture or separation between the human mind and truth, goodness, because you find that, of course, in Kant's moral philosophy, that there's this kind of gap between the human will to the will towards goodness and goodness itself. And so it emphasizes that kind of separation and that gap, or what I would call the nihilistic incongruity, this unbridgeable gap between what we desire and what we can actually gain. So you have a whole bunch of thinkers that follow in that tradition. The Russian tradition in nihilism goes back to thinkers like Bakunin, who utilize this idea of kind of ground clearing, a kind of eradication, an annihilation of the present political order, without a clear conception of what's to come. Now, the Russian nihilists were negative in the sense of wanting to negate and to clear away what they saw as corrupt political institutions, but their negation was in service of opening up a space in which something else could happen. So they still had this this aspiration, as I see it, towards a certain value, towards justice. I mean, the reason they wanted to negate the present order was because they thought it was unjust, and they wanted to open up a space for the creation of a new order, even though they themselves didn't have a conception of what that order would be. I think the epitome of this was Nechayev, who wrote a small pamphlet. Some people claim that Bakunin was implicated in the writing of the pamphlet, Catechism of the Revolutionary, where he lays out the life of a revolutionary as being completely negative, that there is no positive aspect to the revolutionary. The revolutionary is there to destroy, and that destruction is in service of future generations.
Right.
So the Russian tradition of nihilism is more specifically politically oriented, but I think some authors they claim that they're two different phenomena altogether. I think that there's a common thread between them, however, and I think that common thread has to do with the aspiration towards something which is out of grasp. With the German form of nihilism, the things that are out of grasp are conceptual things, such as truth and goodness and such. In the case of the Russian nihilists, what's out of grasp is, I don't know if you'd want to call it more concrete, but something like justice or a just political system. And so, that's how I would categorize those two trends. Now, I think the linkage between them actually is Hegel.
All right. Yeah. True.
So Hegel is, he's in this German tradition of writing that he's familiar with that, that tradition. And then, of course, the Russian revolutionaries were familiar with Hegel. And so I think that's the kind of linkage between them, at least.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, to elaborate a bit on Hegel, but I suppose I can reformulate what you said in a nutshell, that in both them, what is common in both nihilism, both trends, both versions of nihilism, as you say, or as you put it in the book, is that there is something which is not attainable. I mean, there is something out of grasp, as you said, something that's not graspable actually. But in case of Kant or like this enlightenment thought, it is more of a kind of epistemological problem. I mean, epistemological unattainability, while in the Russian version, it seems to be more of a political balance or a political attainability, I suppose.
That's fair. I think that's fair. Although in Kant, there's also the ethical dimension.
The
So
ethical dimension as well.
epistemological, ethical, and political. Yeah.
True, and political. Yeah, it's more inclusive.
And, I mean, and in my view, you can have as many different types of nihilisms as there are different types of ideals that you're aspiring.
True. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and so, you know, I have friends who, you know, who identify as liberals, and you know, they talk about pure equality. Well, you're a liberal nihilist.
Yeah. True. Yeah. So, I mean, to go a bit further with that, like the second question, let's say, is, I mean, to make it a bit more palpable and tangible for these students, the relation between your take of nihilism and humor. What actually brought you to humor? I mean, it is, there were probably a kind of I don't know, something. What was your interest? I mean, what, like, the original interest in humor, inherent in humor for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. Good thing for me to think about, because my entrance into philosophy was through nihilism.
True. Yeah.
When I was a teenager, you know, I began getting interested in nihilism. I started reading books that I didn't understand. I knew that there was something in there that was important for me and that spoke to me, but I couldn't yet understand it as a teenager. I think the first book on nihilism that I picked up when I was in high school was Stanley Rosen's book, Nihilism, a Philosophical Essay, and it made no sense to me. But it's one of those books that I've come back to again and again throughout my life. And what it was that spoke to me about nihilism was the critical element of it, and how many of the things that I really liked and that I was really into as a teenager were criticized by other people as being nihilistic. So the music I liked, I was into punk rock music. You know, and that was nihilistic. That was like the worst thing in the world.
Yeah, true.
Interesting. So I like this music which is nihilistic, or art, you know, the art that I liked, or the books that I read. Really into existentialist books, you know, Jean-Paul Sartre and you know, Camus, Beauvoir. They were called nihilists by various critics. But I started to think, I guess I'm a nihilist. All of these things I like are being called nihilistic, but the critics are calling them nihilistic in a negative sense, and I don't think it's negative. So what's going on? And so I guess my career in philosophy is in trying to figure out what nihilism is, what it is that I find attractive about it, and how to become comfortable with that. And that's the linkage with humor. It was, you know, laterally that I started to realize that many of the things that people call nihilistic, I just thought were funny. Made me laugh, you know, maybe in a sick way or in an absurd way.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that's where my interest in humor picked up, was one that it seemed like a natural response to some of the things that other people reacted to with, you know, with disgust or horror or, you know, outrage. Humorous reaction. Why was that? What is it that that prompted me to, you know, to respond that way? And two, it seems that when you're talking about humor, the general consensus contra nihilism is that humor is a positive thing.
Right.
So this seemed like, you know, a positive way of reacting to something that other people thought was a negative thing. So it seemed, I suppose, healthier. And, you know, that became more amplified for me through reading Nietzsche later on. You know, Nietzsche really advocates this sort of, you know, humorous perspective as a sign of strength, you know, a sign of spiritual strength. And so, you know, once I was in college, I started reading a lot of, you know, humor theory, which there wasn't a lot of. There's a lot of stuff on nihilism.
Right. Yeah.
Little philosophy, or there used to be. There's a growing literature now, but there used to be a very small literature on, you know, philosophy.
Yeah. True.
So that it was because of my interest in nihilism that I got interested in humor, and then they seemed to come together for me. Because of course many of the authors that are criticized as being nihilistic are also kind of absurdist, and absurdism is something that I think a lot of people can immediately recognize as being connected with humor.
Yeah, true, true. Yeah. Um, I mean, but it seems that among these three prevailing dominant theories of humor, like superiority theory of humor, relief theory of humor, or release theory of humor, and the incongruity theory of humor, you seem to be more interested. I mean, at least the argument in your book is more towards the incongruity theory of humor. Of course, there are moments that you talk about relief. Definitely, one can interpret it that way too. But what is there in incongruity theory in general, and what is its relevant to your project in nihilism? I mean, what is the common link between nihilistic incongruity and incongruity in humor?
Right. So what struck me about incongruity theory in humor was that it offers an explanation as to how it is that, why it is that I would react with, laughter or with amusement to a kind of incongruity that occurs in nihilistic phenomenon. So, as we were saying, in nihilism, at least in my conception of it, what you have is an incongruity between one's aspirations, one's highest ideals, the things that one wants to accomplish, and one's concrete real life abilities to accomplish those things. So there's a gap or an incongruity between what you're able to accomplish and what you ultimately would desire to accomplish. Now, that sort of incongruity traditionally has been seen as a bad thing. What's worse than not being able to accomplish your goals? I don't know how it is at the schools you're teaching at, but in our school, everything is focused towards success. Students have to be successful. Everything is, it converges on success. And I understand that. And of course, all of us want to, accomplish our goals, but there's something to be said for failure as well. I know I've failed many, many times in school and in other aspects of my life, and being able to deal with that and not see that as the worst thing in the world, is important. So what I call nihilistic incongruity is that incongruity that's normally been seen as a negative sort of thing, as a failure, as ultimate failure. Now, with the incongruity theory in humor, what you have is a kind of view that a kind of natural response of humans to unthreatening incongruities is to find them amusing. And there's all kinds of explanations for this. Like John Morell has a kind of evolutionary explanation that the reason why we find unthreatening incongruities humorous is because it kind of forces us to linger with something and to puzzle over it and to hone our rational instincts, which is good for evolution and such. I don't know if that's true or not. It's not my concern, but it is the case. It's a phenomenological fact, it seems to me, that there are certain unthreatening incongruities which we do find amusing, like jokes and riddles and even phenomenon, visual phenomenon out in the world. So the linkage here then is it possible to take nihilistic incongruity, which is normally seen as threatening, and to view it through the perspective of a non-threatening phenomenon? And I think it is, and I think people do this all the time. But they don't normally use the term nihilism to describe what it is they're encountering. So, as we said at the beginning of our talk today, if nihilism is this incongruity between your highest ideals and your concrete abilities, there are some positive things about this. So to have a gap between what your goal is and what you're able to accomplish now gives you something to do. It keeps you active in the world.
Yeah, I mean, just I just wanted to follow this your latest remarks on incongruity and this question that is it? I mean, is it so that you limit the potentials of humor to minor incongruities of life? Because there is a part in the book you talk about like dramatic incongruities, like seeing a car crash in front of you, and some minor incongruities. Is it right?
Well, major and minor, I think, is in the mind of the beholder. You say Aristotle says, in Poetics, the difference between comedy and tragedy is simply the mode of presentation. It's not something that's objectively present, in the world itself. It's something that it has to do with our frame.
True, and here you also, sorry to interrupt you, here you also quote from Walter Kaufman. There is a part in the book you quote from Walter Kaufman, and our perception of comedy and tragedy is basically our attitude. I mean, they're not that afar, they're not that different, basically.
Right. Comedy and tragedy both involve incongruity. With tragic incongruity, you've got something that provokes a distressed response. With comic incongruity, you've got something that provokes an amused response.
Sure.
So the key, as I see it, with transforming one's attitude towards nihilism is figuring how to adopt the frame. Now, I'm not saying that one should laugh at everything, or that one should be frivolous. That's one of the criticisms that I've been subject to, is that some people think that I'm saying that the world is just a frivolous place and then we should be kind of laughing at everything. That's not a balanced life. I mean, that's not appropriate. But I do think it is healthy to harness a humorous attitude or perspective to avoid being absolutely crushed by some of the biggest incongruities. I mean, death. There's nothing we can do about death. One of my favorite authors, Yukio Mishima, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a Japanese author, committed suicide, and his suicide note left on his desk said, "Life is finite, yet I would love to live forever." And then he killed himself. And my criticism of his whole body of work is that he wanted to prematurely dissolve the incongruity between his finitude and and infinitude. Perhaps if one could shift one's perspective on the absurdity of life to one that's more humorous rather than tragic, we can endure life and live another day, and, accomplish things that we wouldn't have accomplished otherwise. I think that I wouldn't. I'm not trying to belittle the pains of life, but to I'm looking for a way to endure things that otherwise seem unendurable to some people.
Actually, that connects to the fourth question I've written here. Actually, my question relates itself to the part in the book you're talking about. I mean, that's a key word. Actually, you're talking about cultivating or cultivation. I mean, as if you're also looking for a kind of ethics of humor in the end in the book. I mean, there is a part you say, I quote from you, cultivating an understanding of the incongruous phenomena within an ever grander, unthreatening context. Is your book an ethics? I mean, does your book offer also an ethics of humor where humor can be cultivated and realized in relation to oneself?
I hope so. I think so. I do think that, in a sense, it is good to have a sense of humor, and I suppose that's my ethical angle, is that I'm advocating a certain perspective, the humorous perspective, which I think is a good perspective, and it's ethical in that sense. I think in a more detailed sense, there is an ethics embedded in the book, insofar as I think that when you cultivate a sense of humor, it helps one to be, how can I say it, be fairer with the people that are around us. I mean, we're living in times where people don't really listen to one another, where people are so morally certain of their position that they don't engage in fine-tuned dialogue with other people. And I think a sense of humor is something that can help us to be more ethical in the sense of communicating with one another in a more authentic and caring way. I mean, the humorous perspective is one that is aware of incongruities and isn't threatened of them. Today, people seem to be threatened by anyone who has a position that's incongruous with theirs. I don't understand why that's so threatening, why it is so important for people to be correct and right, and to paint others in such broad strokes without recognizing those fine-tuned contradictions that are in everyone's positions about the world. And so I suppose there's an ethical message there. Personally, I find people that are unable to deal with ambiguity really aggravating. It's very, very aggravating to try to have a decent conversation with someone who will not admit to the ambiguity of the world.
True.
And so, the humorous attitude to me is an attitude which is comfortable with ambiguity. It finds pleasure in ambiguity, and it's willing to go with that, rather than trying to always shut it down and always trying to be right. I think a lot of the, how should I put it, big mouths in the world today are those who think that they've got it all figured out.
Definitely. Although I think there is another facet to this. I mean, the reason I highlighted this cultivation of humor was that I suppose there should be a kind of resistance to this to reduction of humor to some sort of to witticism, because when we talk about cultivating humor, we should bear in mind that it is not an innate faculty. It's not, it's not something that you're born with, definitely, or necessarily. It is something that you can develop, you can flourish in yourself. That's why I think that was actually, it was also important in my dissertation on humor to make a difference between humor and witticism, because for me, humor was an attitude to life, though witticism is more a kind of like playing with words. Probably you can produce one-liners, you can you agree with this?
I agree. No, I absolutely agree with you. I think you're absolutely right. Traditionally it seems as though all the language that's associated with amusement have sort of been lumped together, and from a work like what you're doing and what later theorists have been doing is trying to be more conceptually clear about those types of distinctions. And I absolutely applaud you making that distinction between humor and wit. Freud makes the distinction between humor, jokes, comedy, and wit. Is it wit? I think that's the last one he has.
I think that's chat. That's like German word for joke. So yeah, joke, wit, and humor, and comedy. Sorry, yeah.
He talks about wordplay as being
wordplay,
basic form of of this phenomenon. But his short paper on humor, which he wrote, I believe it was after he wrote the book, Jokes in the Relation.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
in that, he gets into a little bit more depth about precisely what you're saying. Humor is not even necessarily accompanied by laughter. Humor is not reducible to a joke or comedy. It's the perspective, or I would call it a skill that you can develop, that allows you to create jokes and allows you to be witty and allows you to play around with words. And it's a skill that, I agree with you, can be developed through becoming focused on incongruity in the world and not finding it threatening. And the way you learn not to find things threatening is you encounter them. You repeatedly encounter them and then relate them to things that are familiar. And that's what builds, I believe, a sense of humor. So practicing that, just like Aristotle claims that you have to practice being good in order to be good. It's a habit.
Definitely, yeah.
And I think that with the proper guides and with the proper, persistence, anyone is capable of cultivating their sense of humor. And that is a good thing. It's not a frivolous thing at all.
True. Yeah.
In fact, I think it helps us to give a broader, a more well-textured view of reality.
Interesting. So I go back to the fifth question, actually. Sorry for these plenty of questions I've listed for you. What's interesting for me is that in your project, it seems that humor does not necessarily function as an anti-rational or even anti-enlightenment attitude. I mean, it's even an attitude which can it can definitely reconcile itself with wisdom. Is it true? I mean, it's not against rationality in the end.
I don't think so. I mean, there are some authors who claim that humor, is sort of, at least has a frictional relationship, or is different from being rational, that humor is irrational or whatever. And I don't think that that's the case. I mean, it seems to me that that if the sense of humor is focused on finding incongruities that are in the world that are non-threatening, coming to see them as non-threatening, it involves being able to rationally hold in one's head the incongruous phenomena and to understand their relationships to one another. And so, yeah, there is a rational element that's involved with that. I think that, because incongruity is related to contradiction, and contradiction is seen as, something that is inherently irrational, that's where the view that humor is irrational comes from. But with the sense of humor, it's not that one is necessarily contradicting oneself and one's thinking, but trying to understand the relationship between incongruous elements. So, there is a bridge between these, for instance, with, wordplay. Bridge between incongruous uses of words is that the words themselves have embedded within them different meanings that are being activated at different points. I mean, my logic spend a lot of time talking about things like equivocation, fibulae in language, and there is a logic to the illogic. Like Freud, in his work, talks about dream logic. From a certain perspective, dreams seem completely irrational, but then when you analyze the dreams, you can sort of decode the language of them. Likewise, I think there's a kind of language of humor. There's a kind of language, of incongruity that can be decoded rationally. And for me, what justifies this is coming to terms with gaining pleasure, or gaining pleasure from the decoding of the incongruities. I don't know that it has to do with evolution or those other things, but I do know that for the individual, there is something that's edifying about adopting the humor sense.
True. Another topic that interests me and still interests me is the relation between humor and seriousness, actually. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there are parts in the book that you talk about it, and it seems to be also interesting for you. I mean, as a phenomenon, you can also see it even in people like Kierkegaard. I mean, uh, in in I mean, the anti-climacus that has this always has this occupation to be between serious and jest. I mean, seriousness and jest, or Ernsthaftigkeit, as they call it in German. What is your take on the relation between humor and seriousness?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think a well-balanced life has both of these aspects to it. I mean, I think there's some point in the book where you point out if someone was constantly, laughing, they're just a buffoon. Someone who's never serious is a buffoon, but someone who's always serious is, just as bad. Sartre and Beauvoir, talk about the over-serious person. The person who engages in over-seriousness is one that, again, they think that meaning exists out there in the world. They don't realize that that meaning is something that's imposed upon the world. And so the over serious person is someone who's inauthentic. They're in a state of bad faith that way. I mean, someone who can never laugh at themselves or laugh at the world, they seem to think they've got it figured out. So but a person who's never able to commit themselves and to seriously pursue a goal, never is not active, doesn't have any direction in life. And so, I mean, I think that, the nihilist mindset is one that has both, or potentially should have both of these aspects operant. I mean, a nihilist insofar as there's a kind of distress that's involved with falling short from one's goals, is committed to goals. And so there's a serious commitment to goals. That's why nihilism is distressing. And yet, if one can, take a step back and realize that your commitment to goals, really doesn't mean all that much in the grand scheme of things, that's where I think the humorous attitude is helpful. In your seriousness, you can avoid falling into despair by laughing at oneself. I guess in a nutshell, I think a well-balanced personality contains elements of seriousness and elements of humor. I mean, my sense is that for me, humor ultimately, in the big picture, trumps seriousness, because from the way I look at myself and the world and the people around, ultimately, all of this is kind of absurd.
True, yeah. And it also reminded me of Thomas Nagel's view from nowhere, like this view that you have the absolute cosmos or the absolute time, and we are nothing in the end,
Right. Yeah. I think Bertrand Russell also wrote a paper on that topic that I remember when I read it as a student, it struck me as really, I don't know, sort of a little bit too, melodramatic, describing the senselessness of human life in the grand scheme of things. And I don't know. It made me laugh because it seems so.
True. What was really fascinating for me in the end of the book was that you sort of attached your whole argument discussion about humor to these social facets and this discourse of success, as I call it. I mean, vis-a-vis failure, as you were talking about it earlier. What's interesting or what's paradoxical in this discourse, this kind of new age discourse of success, is that although it pretends to be happy and humorous, they actually try to do away with humor, or because they actually try to do away with tensions, with incongruities. I mean, your examples about schooling, and like the failures in the school. I suppose it's really a very illuminating point in the book for me that there are some
concrete demands, even in, I mean, even in the level of education that we can take from your book, like what is the relation between humor and education? How can we teach humor like implicitly or practically to our students in the class?
Yeah, well, I think that it's really important in the classroom setting and in education, because I mean, I'm convinced that that if instructors and students are not willing to take chances and to go down blind paths, go down dead ends, that there's really no chance of having a real education. I mean, a real education is an exploration. Kind of like Heidegger in that essay Wood Paths. He likens thinking to walking through the woods. Coming to the end of a path that leads nowhere. You don't go, oh my gosh, I failed.
True, yeah.
I mean, you don't do that. And
True.
likewise, you shouldn't do that in education. I mean, I think education should be, coming to dead ends in education should be unthreatening, so that we see it as as something that we've learned, something that makes it safe to to explore further. And so I think that a humorous attitude applied to the classroom and to education is really important. I mean, when I was a student as an undergraduate, I know there were times where I was afraid to engage in discourse with other students and with teachers because I was afraid to be wrong. And I think that's destructive. This fear that I'm going to do something wrong, I'm going to say something wrong. We all say things that are wrong. I think the best bit of advice that I had, which was kind of, I don't know, it was kind of funny, from one of my philosophy professors once, was he said to me, he said, "Don't be afraid to speak up in class." He says, next week, no one's going to even remember what you said.
True.
Which, on the one hand, it seems, oh, great, no one's going to remember, no one cares. But, on the other hand, there's a liberation about that. And I think that's what humor gives to specifically education. It kind of, it liberates you to see that what you're doing in education is, I mean, it's a very important game. It's a very important game that you're playing. And in order to play the game well, you have to be vulnerable, you have to be open, you have to be willing to make mistakes. And the humorous attitude, again, sees that as unthreatening. So it's important to try to get things right, but it's not that bad to get things wrong.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I mean, this actually, I suppose I can even generalize a bit further this fear that that a student experiences in the class to even a social fear that you experience in a society. It can also hinder, in a way, humor or appreciating the tensions in life. Like I suppose this fear can be everywhere, and humor can be a very subtle mechanism against that.
Absolutely. I mean, you remind me of Nietzsche's whole discussion of the eternal return, and this this crushing sort of awful feeling that everything is is absurd. So what does he say? It's the worst form of nihilism in a sense, but it's also liberating.
Yeah.
There's a liberation that occurs from that. I mean, I've gone down dead ends career-wise, writing-wise, life, friendship-wise with friends, but to be crushed by every sort of dead end, to be crushed by every sort of failure in life, I mean, that's, I guess I'd just say it's sad. It's sad that mindset. Much more invigorating and liberating and healthy to see those as, I mean, setbacks and such that contribute to, like Nietzsche says, who you are.
Yeah, true.
Be able to embrace, everything that has led to the culmination point, which is you. And that, to me, that's what a humorous attitude is. Again, it's not a humor, but it's taking pleasure in in these experiences, in these setbacks and these incongruities, rather than feeling that they're outright failures.
True. Yeah.
So I would absolutely agree with you that for life in general, not just education itself, but for life in general, a humorous attitude in this, in this elevated sense, the sense of objective capacity to sort through, our experiences in the world and to take pleasure from the absurdities and the incongruities.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Yeah, I'm even tempted to add that humor can even boost courage in human being. Like effectively speaking, I mean, it can really.
Can you say a little bit about that?
Just like talking about fear and how fear of incongruities can make you bereft of humor, can deprive you from humor. I mean, the opposite can also be true, that humor can imply or can entail, let's say, taking life as it is with courage, or like what Nietzsche calls amor fati, like to love your fate, with all the incongruities implied inside it,
Right. I've seen this with students at the school that I teach at, where there are certain students who initially at the beginning of the semester seem shy and all of that, and I start seeing them come out of their shell, and that at a certain point, I have one student in particular in mind. They've become very, very vocal in class, and are interacting, and then this one day the student starts talking, starts kind of sort of expounding on an issue, and as they were going through the issue, they got themselves all wrapped in knots, and they just kind of went, oh yeah, well. It was like, it wasn't this terrible sort of thing, but as you said, there was this kind of courage that seemed to be built up in them that allowed them to to say nonsense, to say something that was ridiculous, and to recognize that it was ridiculous, and not to be crushed by that, but to find it
true. Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can also, on the other hand, you can also encourage others. Like, I mean, imagine you're facing a student who is shy, who is introvert, who is not opening or talking. I suppose a teacher, with his or her self-mockery, with his or her self-humiliation, can open the student to, it can encourage the student to open himself or herself, like it gives the other the elbow room to talk, to act, with humor, we can also give each other more chance of flourishing, blossoming.
Absolutely. Well, I think that that's one of the ways that that all of us have to cultivate that capacity in ourselves. Is we do have to have guides. We have to have someone who models this capacity, who demonstrates to us that this is not, failure is not the worst thing in the world. I mean, you have to be vulnerable with students that way, and demonstrate demonstrate what's possible this way. I was working on a paper on Diogenes, the Greek cynic, in this way, and that's how I interpret what he was doing. That many people are horrified by his actions, but what I think he was trying to do was to be the type of teacher that you're suggesting here, where he goes out into public and he engages in activities that really shouldn't threaten anyone, and he's demonstrating, look, there's nothing to fear from from acting this way. That your social conventions and your social fears are not necessary. There's nothing fearful here. And some people are able to kind of adopt that attitude and to see the message. Other people are not able to. So I suppose again, from the grand scheme of things, teachers also have to be aware of the fact that sometimes they're going to fail in in trying to convey.
Fascinating, John. Do you have any final message for the audience?
Laugh at everything. I don't know. The world can be pretty awful sometimes. It can wound us, but even by being wounded, there's something to be learned in life. you can't go backwards, you can only go forwards. And so I think a humorous attitude and being able to, kind of chuckle at the world, it's a very, very important skill to develop. And it's very, very helpful in ultimately becoming comfortable in your own skin, I think.
Right. Fascinating. That was a very fascinating talk to you. It was really interesting. I really enjoyed it. And I hope we can talk more. I mean, next time probably, yeah, we can.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, we can. I mean, I hope we can all even organize a kind of online chat where some students are also present.
Sure.
Probably. And it would be really fascinating to meet you again, John. And I should thank you again for the time and the energy you shared with me.
Oh no, I thank you for for having your interest and to inviting me to do this. This is another example of how something like this weird world situation and a pandemic can actually result in something quite positive.
Right. Yeah. So who knows? Hopefully, perhaps even see you in Berlin or in Iran.
I would love that.
Yeah, definitely.
We were hoping to travel this summer, but we were talking about going to Italy this summer, but that all fell through, of course.
Oh yeah, I know.
But
yeah.
It would be wonderful to meet you face to face when when it's possible. And yeah,
Definitely.
I would love to talk more with you. I'd love to hear more about your dissertation topic.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Anyway, you're most welcome here in Berlin if you happen to come to Europe.
That would be wonderful. Thank you very much, Maddie.
Thank you, John. Thank you, and have a good day, I suppose. What time is it there now?
It is now just about noon.
Okay, so now it is 9 o'clock here in the evening.
Time for me to sit down and read a Gomben.
And enjoy that. Okay.
Right.
Goodbye, John. Ciao. Bye.